The dust on the high plains was a constant companion. It was a fine red powder that got into your clothes, your food, your lungs. It settled on Jonah's shoulders as he stood by the stagecoach stop, a place that was nothing more than a single bench baking under a sun that offered no mercy. He'd been staring at the horizon for an hour, watching the heat shimmer and dance. 6 months. It had been 6 months since he sent the letter, the one with the money tucked inside. It was a desperate move, he knew that. But it was practical, too. He'd bought himself a wife. Not for love, not in the way the poets talked about. This was a transaction meant to buy an end to the silence, an end to the crushing, soul-deep loneliness of his sprawling ranch, a place he'd clawed out of this hard, unforgiving land with his own 2 hands. The advertisement was simple. A respectable woman from back east. Her name was Anna. She was looking for a steady husband, a new start. Jonah was a simple man. He expected a simple deal. Then he saw it, a dark shape disturbing the shimmering heat. The stagecoach. It rattled into view, a tired, lumbering beast kicking up a cloud of dirt, the color of rust. His heart, which had been quiet for years, began to hammer against his ribs, a steady, hopeful rhythm. The driver pulled the horses to a stop, the man's face a mask of weariness. He grunted a hello as the door creaked open. But the woman who stepped out wasn't Anna. It wasn't the woman from the photograph. Instead, 2 young Chinese women were nudged from the coach, stumbling into the dirt like frightened birds. They were dressed in worn but clean traveling clothes, their dark eyes wide, swimming with a fear so profound it was almost a physical thing. The younger one, barely a woman at all, clung to the elder's arm, her knuckles white. Pinned to the elder sister's dress was a piece of paper, a crude, hastily scrawled note. Jonah's mind reeled. This wasn't right. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dirt, and gently plucked the note from her dress. The words were a slap in the face, a punch to the gut. 2 for 1 bargain. Enjoy the joke. The stagecoach driver spat a stream of tobacco juice, careful not to look Jonah in the eye. That's them, he muttered. Paid for and delivered. Before Jonah could even form a question, before he could voice his rage, the driver cracked his whip. The coach lurched away, leaving him standing there, alone. Alone with 2 silent, terrified strangers under a sky so vast and empty it felt like it was swallowing them whole. His hope didn't just fade, it curdled. It turned into a cold, hard knot of anger in his stomach. Not for himself, not for his own disappointment. It was for them, for the casual, brutal cruelty of it all. He looked from the hateful note to the 2 women. The elder one met his gaze. She held her chin high, a silent fire burning in her eyes. It was a look that dared him to be just as cruel as the man who sent them. And in that one, single moment, the loneliness he had paid to cure was gone. It was replaced by something else entirely, a raw, protective instinct he never knew he had. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer them water, to try and explain that this was all some terrible mistake. But the words never came, because a new sound reached his ears, the thundering of hooves. Fast, coming from the direction of town. A trio of riders crested the nearby rise. They moved with an arrogant swagger that spoke of unchecked power. The man in the lead was huge, his bulk straining the buttons of his vest. A silver star was pinned crookedly to his chest. Sheriff Barlow. The other 2 were his deputies, men with mean, empty faces who flanked him like vultures waiting for something to die. Barlow reined in his horse, a sneer twisting his lips. He took in the scene, Jonah, the 2 terrified women, the fading dust of the stagecoach. Well now, Jonah, he drawled, his voice thick and syrupy like spoiled honey. Looks like my property found its way to you. He gestured dismissively toward the sisters, who flinched as if struck. Appreciate you holding 'em for me. Jonah's hand fell to his hip, his fingers finding the worn leather grip of his Colt Peacemaker. It was an old friend, and it felt heavier than usual. "They aren't property, Barlow," Jonah said. His voice was low and steady, a rumble of thunder on a calm day. "And they're not yours." The sheriff let out a wet, unpleasant chuckle. "Oh, but they are," he insisted. "Won 'em fair and square. Poker game with a railroad foreman down on his luck." He was enjoying this, soaking in Jonah's confusion and the women's fear. "Thought I'd have a bit of sport. Send 'em out here to the loneliest rancher in the territory, a little joke." His eyes, small and cruel, glinted with malice as he stared at the sisters. "Looks like you didn't appreciate the punchline." He swung his leg over his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. "Now step aside, Jonah. I'm taking them back to town. Got a buyer lined up already." The younger sister, Mai, let out a small, terrified whimper. The elder one, Lynn, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Her gaze was locked on Barlow, and it was filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Jonah saw everything in that one horrible instant. The sheriff's sadism, the sister's terror, the utter depravity of it all. There was a line in the sand, a moral compass he'd lived by his whole life, and it was pointing in only one direction. He took a half-step forward, deliberately planting himself between Barlow and the women. "They're on my land now," he stated. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. "And they're not leaving." The air went tight. It crackled with a tension you could almost see. Barlow's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl of disbelief, then pure fury. "Are you drawing a line against the law, rancher?" he snarled, his hand dropping to the butt of his own holstered pistol. Jonah didn't even flinch. "I'm drawing a line against you." He knew it was a fool's stand. One man against three, one simple rancher against a corrupt sheriff with the law in his pocket. But the thought of handing these women over to a monster like Barlow? It was impossible. It wasn't a choice. It was a fact. And then he did something they never expected. With a speed that seemed impossible for his size, Jonah didn't draw on Barlow. He spun on his heel and fired a single shot. Not at the men. At the dry, brittle fencing of his nearby horse corral. The crack of the pistol echoed across the plains, and the sound of splintering wood was like a second gunshot. The horses inside, already skittish, went wild. With a collective snort of panic, half a dozen powerful animals burst through the weakened fence, a wave of horseflesh and fury thundering directly toward the sheriff and his men. It was pure, beautiful chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Deputies shouted curses as they fought to control their spooked mounts. Barlow, caught completely off guard, was wrestling with his own panicked horse. It was the only diversion Jonah was going to get, and he knew it. He grabbed Lynn's arm. "Run!" he yelled over the den. "To the cabin!" For a split second, she hesitated, her eyes questioning him, searching his face. But the raw urgency in his voice was undeniable. She grabbed Mai's hand, and they ran. Their feet were light on the hard-packed earth, their dark hair flying behind them. Jonah fired another shot into the air, just to keep the deputies busy. Then he followed, his long strides eating up the ground. He slammed the heavy oak door of the cabin behind them, the sound echoing the frantic beating of his own heart. He threw the thick wooden bolt into place. He leaned against the door, breathing heavily, listening. The sound of angry shouting and retreating hoofbeats slowly faded into the vast silence of the prairie. Silence fell inside the cabin. It was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breaths in the dim, dusty interior. He was an outlaw, a stranger in his own home, now sharing it with two women whose names he didn't even know, and the corrupt law of the entire county was hunting them all. The simple, predictable life he had craved, the one he had tried to buy for a few $100s, had just been blown to pieces, and this was only the beginning. Night fell, like a black shroud, bringing a quiet that felt deeply dishonest. Jonah knew Barlow would be back. He wouldn't let this humiliation stand. Jonah had given the sisters his own room, a small, sparse space with a single bed and a window that looked out onto the endless, open range. He'd taken up a post by the main room's hearth, his Winchester rifle resting across his knees. He listened. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the cabin walls sounded like an approaching enemy. He was a fugitive on his own land. They all were. Sometime after midnight, the door to the bedroom opened a crack. It was Lynn, the elder sister. She moved with a silent grace that was startling. She carried a small, chipped cup in her hands. She approached him cautiously, like a deer approaching a stream, and offered it to him. It was tea, hot, fragrant, and steaming in the cool night air. He took it, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said. The words felt small, inadequate for everything that had happened. She nodded, her face a mystery in the flickering firelight. Instead of returning to the room, she sat on the floor a few feet away, her back perfectly straight, a silent sentinel sharing his vigil. "He will come back," she said. Her English was soft, but it was clear, tinged with an accent that was almost melodic. Jonah was stunned. He hadn't expected her to speak the language at all, let alone so well. "I know," he replied, his eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness outside the window. "With more men," she added. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. She was silent for a long time after that, just watching the flames dance and writhe in the hearth. Then she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper, but each word was like a stone dropped into a still pond. "He lies. Sheriff Barlow." Jonah turned his full attention to her, the warmth of the tea forgotten in his hands. "We were not one in a game." He saw her hands clench in her lap, the knuckles showing white in the dim light. "My father was a physician," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, of defiance. "An herbalist. He made medicines for the men working on the railroad." She took a deep breath. "Barlow runs an opium trade. He uses the company's supply wagons to smuggle it. My father found out. He threatened to expose him." The story tumbled out of her, a torrent of injustice and pain. "So Barlow framed him. He said my father was a poisoner, that his medicines had killed a man. It was all a lie. He took everything from us, our shop, our home, and then he took us." The revelation hit Jonah like a physical blow. This wasn't just a cruel joke played by a bored, sadistic sheriff. This was calculated, vicious, pure evil. These women weren't just property to be bartered away. They were witnesses to be silenced. His decision at the stagecoach stop, what he thought was a simple act of human decency, had just become a matter of life and death. He wasn't just protecting victims anymore. He was protecting the key to bringing down a tyrant who had an entire county in his grip. The weight of it settled on him, heavier than any mountain. Barlow wouldn't just come back with more men. He would come back to burn this cabin to the ground with all of them inside. The attack came in the gray, blurry hour just before dawn, the time when a man's senses are at their dullest and his will is at its weakest. Jonah had been right. Barlow returned, and this time he brought 6 men with him. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin like wolves circling their prey. The first bullet wasn't a warning. It splintered the wood of the window frame right next to Jonah's head, showering his face with sharp slivers of pine. He didn't even think. He dropped to the floor, rolling behind a heavy wooden table as more shots shattered the glass, the sound like cracking ice. "Get down!" he yelled towards the bedroom. The crack of rifles was deafening in the small space, each shot a hammer blow against the thin wooden walls. He cautiously peered over the edge of the table, firing his Winchester methodically. He was a good shot, raised to hunt on this land, but he was pinned down. 1 man against 7. The odds were impossible. He got lucky. taking down one of the deputies with a clean shot through the darkness, but two more were already advancing on the blind side of the cabin, using the woodshed for cover. He had no angle on them. He couldn't see them. Then, through a gap in the wall, he saw one of them raise his rifle. He was aiming directly for the flimsy wall of the bedroom, the wall where Lynn and Mai were hiding. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, washed over him. He tried to shift his position, to get a clear shot, but another volley of bullets kicked up dirt and splinters in front of him, forcing him back down. He was trapped. This was it. They were all going to die here. And then something flashed in his peripheral vision, a flicker of movement from the shattered bedroom window. A dark shape arced through the pre-dawn gloom. It moved with an impossible speed, silent as an owl's flight. The deputy who had been aiming at the bedroom wall grunted. It was a choked, surprised sound. He dropped his rifle and staggered backward, his hands clutching at his throat. The handle of a perfectly balanced throwing knife was protruding from his neck. He collapsed into a heap without another sound. Jonah stared, his mind unable to process what he had just seen. Before the other deputy by the woodshed could even react to his partner's sudden fall, a second knife flew from the window. It embedded itself deep in the man's shoulder with a sickening, wet thud. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and shock, and fell back, his own rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky. The sudden, lethal precision of the attack stunned Barlow's men. For one precious second, there was a shocked, disbelieving silence, and in that moment of silence, Jonah saw Lynn's face in the broken window. Her expression wasn't one of fear. It was a mask of cold, focused fury. She was not a helpless victim cowering in a corner. She was a warrior. The realization sent a jolt of electricity through him. He used the deputy's hesitation, their sudden fear, to his full advantage. He laid down a furious volley of covering fire, levering the Winchester as fast as his fingers could move. The remaining men, their confidence shattered, scrambled for cover, dragging their wounded comrade with them. They had survived. But Jonah knew this was far from over. Barlow was a man who fed on fear, but now, for the first time, Jonah had seen fear in his men. And it was all because of the woman in the bedroom, the woman he thought he was protecting. He was beginning to wonder who was protecting whom. In the tense, ringing quiet that followed the hasty retreat of Barlow's men, the small cabin felt like a fortress. The immediate threat was gone, but the air was still thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the heavy weight of what had just happened. Jonah found Lynn in the bedroom. She was calmly retrieving her knives from a small, soft leather roll she had laid out on the floor. Mai was huddled on the bed, her face pale with terror, but her eyes were fixed on her sister with a look of absolute, fierce pride. The dynamic between them was suddenly crystal clear. One was the shield, the other was the heart. Jonah leaned against the doorframe, his rifle held loosely in one hand, feeling like a stranger in his own story. "Where?" he asked, his voice rough with awe. "Did you learn to do that?" Lynn finished wiping a spot of blood from a blade on a piece of clean cloth before she looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and deep. "My father believed a woman should know how to protect herself," she said simply, as if explaining how to bake bread. "He taught me many things, how to use herbs to heal, and how to use steel to harm." Her gaze flickered to a small graze on Jonah's forearm, where a splinter had torn the skin. "Sit," she commanded. Her tone left no room for argument. She unrolled another section of her kit, revealing small, neatly tied packets of dried herbs and clean bandages. As she cleaned the wound, her touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the deadly efficiency he had just witnessed. And as she worked, she told him more. Her father wasn't just a simple herbalist. He was a scholar, a martial artist from a long line of warriors and physicians, forced to flee his homeland after a political upheaval. He had trained her not in the loud, brutal ways of the gun, but in the silent, strategic arts of defense and attack. He taught her about the body's weaknesses, about leverage and speed, about how a well-placed needle could be as deadly as a bullet. When she finished tying off the bandage, her fingers lingered on his arm for a moment. Their eyes met, and in that look, a new understanding passed between them. The space was charged with it. This was no longer his fight alone. He wasn't their savior. They were partners, equals, bound together by a shared, ruthless enemy. They were in this together until the end. They spent the next few hours not resting, but planning. Their heads were bent over a crude map Jonah drew in the dirt on the cabin floor. He knew this land like the back of his hand, every ravine, every dry creek bed, every hidden spring. But Lynn possessed a sharp, tactical mind. She saw vulnerabilities in his defenses and opportunities for attack that he had completely overlooked. They were a good team, but they were about to become a better one. Mai, the younger sister, who had been silent and trembling until now, suddenly spoke. She pointed a small, delicate finger to a spot on his map. "The riders," she said, her English halting but clear. "When they came, they rode around that ridge, not over it." She looked up at Jonah, her eyes wide with the importance of her observation. "The ground is bad there, unstable." It was a small detail, a tiny observation born of fear, but it was critical. Jonah realized she wasn't just the heart, she was the observer. Her fear didn't paralyze her, it sharpened her senses to a razor's edge. They weren't just two people and a victim anymore. They were a three-person team, the gunman, the strategist, and the scout, and their plan began to form. It wasn't a plan of defense, it was a plan of attack. They couldn't win a prolonged siege. They couldn't outrun Barlow's posse forever. Their only hope was to turn the tables, to use the sheriff's own arrogance, his own cruelty, against him. "He thinks we are trapped animals," Lynn said, her dark gaze distant as she formulated the strategy. "He expects us to run for the mountains, to try and lose him in the high country." A small, dangerous smile touched her lips. "We will let him think. He is right." The plan was a masterpiece of misdirection. They would spend the day creating a false trail, a convincing story of a desperate, panicked flight towards the jagged peaks to the north. Jonah, an expert tracker himself, knew exactly how to do it. He would lead one of his horses, letting its shod hooves leave deep, clear impressions in the softer ground. He'd scuff rocks, break branches, all the signs of a group moving in a blind hurry. Lynn added a crucial, brilliant detail. She tore a strip of fabric from Mai's spare dress, a distinctive blue calico. "Leave this on a thorn bush," she instructed Jonah, "about a mile up the trail. Something that looks like it was dropped in a hurry. He will see it as proof of our desperation." While Jonah worked on laying the false trail, the sisters prepared their own contribution. Mai, using the knowledge her father had passed down, gathered specific plants from around the cabin. Plants that, when crushed, left a unique, pungent scent. A scent that tracking animals, and a keen-nosed tracker, might follow for a short distance. They would use it to enhance the beginning of the trail, making it seem even more authentic. As they worked together through the long, hot day, a quiet rhythm developed between Jonah and Lynn. Their communication was sparse, mostly functional, but it was filled with an unspoken understanding. A shared glance over the map, a quick nod of agreement, the simple act of passing a canteen of water, each small gesture built upon the foundation of trust that had been forged in the crucible of the morning's gunfight. He saw not just her strength, but her sharp intelligence and her impossible grace under pressure. She, in turn, saw the steady, unwavering core of the man who had chosen to stand for them when he could have simply and safely turned away. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The trap was set. Barlow, blinded by his own ego, would take the bait. They were certain of it. and while he and his men were chasing shadows up in the mountains, they would be moving in the exact opposite direction, straight back into the serpent's nest, straight back to the heart of his power. Under the faint sliver of a crescent moon, they moved like ghosts. They traveled south, away from the mountains, away from the false trail they had so carefully laid. Their destination was the town of redemption, a place whose name had become a bitter, cruel joke under Sheriff Barlow's rule. Jonah led them through dry arroyos and across rocky mesas, his intimate knowledge of the backcountry keeping them hidden from any potential scouts. They left the horses tethered in a hidden coulee a mile outside of town and proceeded the rest of the way on foot. The town was dark. It was quiet. Most of its decent folk were locked behind their doors, leaving the night to the coyotes and to Barlow's cronies. Their objective was the sheriff's office, a squat stone building that also served as the town jail. "The proof," Lynn whispered, her voice a mere breath of air beside him as they crouched behind a wooden water trough. "He is too arrogant to destroy it. He will keep a record, a ledger of all his dealings." She paused, her eyes glinting in the dark. "My father said it is his one weakness, his vanity. He needs to see his empire written down." They had a second objective, one that was even more important. They had to get that ledger into the hands of U.S. Marshal Vance, who was due to arrive in the neighboring county seat of Silver Creek in just 2 days. It was their only shot at real justice, their only hope of ever being free. Mai was positioned in the darkened loft of the livery stable across the street. She held a small, polished piece of tin in her hand. Her job was to watch the main road, to signal them with a flash of reflected moonlight if Barlow or his men returned unexpectedly. It was a terrifying role for the young girl, but she had insisted. Her quiet determination had become a force all its own. Jonah checked his pistol, the soft click of the hammer being pulled back sounding unnaturally loud in the dead silence. Beside him, Lynn drew one of her knives, its blade a sliver of pure darkness in her hand. They moved across the dusty street, hugging the shadows, their goal just feet away. Jonah worked on the lock of the back office window with a piece of wire he'd pulled from a broken fence post. It took a few tense, heart-pounding moments, but then he heard the soft, satisfying click of the tumblers giving way. They were in. The office stank of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. A single oil lamp on the desk cast long, menacing shadows that danced on the walls. And there it was. Sitting in plain sight on the corner of the desk, as if waiting for them, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It seemed too easy, dangerously easy. They had it. Jonah grabbed the book, its pages filled with the damning evidence of Barlow's crimes. Names, dates, illicit payments for smuggling. And there, near the back, a chillingly brief entry detailing the seizure of an apothecary's assets, an entry that included his 2 daughters. They were just turning to leave, their mission almost complete, when the floorboards of the front porch creaked. A single, sharp flicker of light flashed from the livery stable, Mai's signal. But it was too late. The front door of the office burst open. Sheriff Barlow stood there, his face a mask of pure, triumphant rage. Behind him stood the deputy he'd left behind as a sentry. "Thought you could outsmart me, did you?" Barlow bellowed, his gun already in his hand. "I found your little trail. Looked a bit too perfect. Decided to double back and check." The showdown wasn't going to be in an open canyon at high noon. It was going to be here, in this cramped, cluttered room, in the dead of night. The deputy moved to flank them, to cut off their escape, but Jonah was faster. He shoved the heavy oak desk with all his might. It crashed into the man's legs, knocking him off balance with a cry of pain. Jonah's Colt barked once. The shot wasn't meant to kill, but to disable. The deputy went down, clutching a shattered wrist. But the move left Jonah exposed. Barlow leveled his pistol, a triumphant, ugly sneer spreading across his face. "End of the line, rancher." He had forgotten about Lynn. In the chaos of the overturned desk, she moved like a viper striking from the shadows. She didn't throw a knife. She grabbed a heavy glass inkwell from the floor and threw it, not at Barlow, but at the oil lamp. It shattered. The room was plunged into near-total darkness, save for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. Barlow roared in frustration, firing blindly into the gloom. At that exact moment, a loud crash echoed from across the street. Mai, seeing her sister and Jonah in mortal danger, had shoved a heavy feed barrel from the loft door. It hit the ground with a sound like a cannon shot. For one critical second, Barlow's head jerked toward the sound, his attention diverted by the unexpected noise. It was the only opening Jonah needed. He lunged through the darkness, a human battering ram. His body slammed into the larger man, sending them both crashing through the office window and onto the dusty street outside. The ledger flew from Jonah's hand, skittering across the dirt. They wrestled for control of Barlow's gun, two desperate men fighting for their lives in the pale moonlight. The fight was brutal, raw. Barlow was stronger, his sheer bulk a weapon in itself, but Jonah was quicker, fueled by a righteous fury that burned hotter than any fire. He managed to twist the sheriff's wrist until the gun clattered to the ground. He landed a solid punch to Barlow's jaw, sending the big man stumbling back. Just as Jonah scrambled for his own pistol, Barlow did something no one expected. He drew a concealed knife from his boot, its long blade gleaming wickedly. He lunged, but Lynn was there. She had come through the broken window right after them, a dark, silent wraith. She didn't attack Barlow directly. She threw one of her own knives with perfect, breathtaking precision. Not at him, at the gun on the ground. The blade struck the pistol's metal frame with a loud clang, sending it spinning away into the shadows, out of reach of either man. The fight was now hand-to-hand, primitive and deadly. As Barlow turned on her, his rage making him clumsy, Jonah tackled him from behind. By now, the town was stirring. Lights were appearing in windows. Drawn by the gunshots and the commotion, people began to cautiously emerge from their homes. They saw the three figures locked in a desperate struggle in the middle of their main street. They saw their corrupt sheriff, snarling like a cornered animal. They saw the lone rancher and the Chinese woman, who moved with the deadly grace of a panther. It was Mai's final act that broke the stalemate. She slid down the rope from the loft, and with a courage she never knew she possessed, she darted into the street and retrieved the fallen ledger. She held it up high, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the night air. "Here!" she cried. "Here is the proof of his crimes!" Seeing the book, the source of his power, the record of his secrets, held aloft in the hands of his victim, seemed to break something inside Barlow. His wild charge faltered. In that split second of hesitation, Jonah delivered a final, decisive blow that knocked the wind from the big man and sent him sprawling into the dust, defeated. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as Jonah stood over their tyrant, his chest heaving. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He just had the unshakable certainty of justice. A day later, when U.S. Marshal Vance rode into town, he found Sheriff Barlow locked in his own jail cell. The ledger of his crimes sat on the desk, and a strange, resilient new family stood guard over a town that was, for the first time in years, truly named Redemption. The charges against Lynn and Mai's father were cleared, his name and honor restored. Their freedom was absolute. Jonah offered them a home on his ranch, not as refugees he had saved, but as the partners who had saved him in turn. Months passed. The ranch was no longer a monument to one man's loneliness. It was alive. Mai cultivated a sprawling garden, her father's knowledge of herbs and plants blossoming in the rich soil. The air itself seemed to smell of healing and hope. On the porch of the cabin, Jonah and Lynn stood together, watching the sunset paint the sky. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, comfortable, and deep with an understanding that needed no words. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They had faced down a tyrant, stared into the face of true evil, and had forged a new life from the ashes of cruelty and deceit. Here, on this land that had once been so empty, they had built more than a home. They had built a future. If you believe that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button. You never know what story we'll uncover next.